Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Landor Link's webinar series on school transport. Today's session is focused on school streets. My name is Doolin, and I am the Principal Sustainable Transport Planner at Hackney Council, and I lead on Hackney's School Streets program. Today, I'll also be chairing this webinar. So a few bits of housekeeping before we get started. Firstly, today's session will run for just over an hour, and we'll be hearing from 5 speakers in the first half, and then in the second half, we'll have a Q&A session. You are invited to submit questions during the presentation using the question panel in the control bar. Finally, just to let you know that today's session will be recorded and it will be hosted on Landor Link's YouTube channel. So I imagine that everyone joining today are at least partially familiar with school streets. But just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm going to start us off with a definition. School streets are timed road closures around schools that operate 2 times a day, once in the morning and once in the afternoon, to coincide with school opening and closing times. And they are regulated by pedestrian and cyclist only zone signs. So over the past few years, school streets have had a growing platform, both at the local and the national level. And since COVID, school streets are gaining even more attention, as they are a leading solution to avoid car-dominated recovery from lockdown. And today, we have a number of speakers joining us to talk about school streets, to look at the different elements, as well as the role they have to play in our current reality. So our speakers today, as I said, there are 5. We have Adrian Davies, who is a professor of transportation and health at Edinburgh Napier University. Alice Swift, who works for the charity Sustrans as a project coordinator for school streets in the UK. Sylvia, who is a school streets campaigner and runs the School Streets Initiative web platform. Donald Chalker, a principal engineer from Redbridge Council in London. And finally, Tim Daniels, director of Videalert, which are a provider of intelligent traffic enforcement solutions. And they're also today's sponsor. So for our first speaker, we're starting off actually with a double act, as Adrian and Alice are going to talk to us through a new collaborative study on school streets. So Adrian and Alice, if you can please turn on your microphones as well as your videos, and I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Doolin. Good morning, everyone. In the last webinar in this series, my colleague Fiona gave an excellent presentation on successful school streets. So if you're a local authority listening that wants to know how to make your school street scheme work as best it can, I highly recommend giving her presentation a listen. You can find them on the Landor YouTube channel. Today, I'm here not to duplicate what she said, but to talk in a bit more detail about a piece of research that Sustrans is involved in, looking at the impact of school streets, specifically looking at the extent to which they do or don't displace traffic into the surrounding road network and what the consequences of that might be for road safety. Next slide, please. So just to give you first a bit of context briefly, at my last count in May, there are about 130 school streets UK-wide, largely clustered in our big urban areas, over half of them in London. This was about, in Scotland, about 25, about 20 in England, and a handful in Cardiff in Wales. This was before any so-called emergency school streets went in as a response to COVID. And then aside from those, there were a growing number of local authorities who'd been testing the water with school streets, trialing out the concept. Last year at Sustrans, we coordinated a mass school streets event right across the UK, supporting 20 local authorities to trial a school street by holding a car-free day or a school play street at one or more schools in their area. Leeds did something similar for Clean Air Day. And then at some of those schools, we've then worked with the local authority to build on those play streets, those car-free days, and to introduce a full school street scheme. Next slide, please. So what's been our experience? First, there is no one-size-fits-all. School streets, they don't just stand alone. You don't just put in the infrastructure. They do require supporting behaviour change work. And again, I'd refer you to Fiona's brilliant presentation to find out more about that. Second, they do tend to win the support of the majority of parents of the school community and the very local residents. During our mass trial last year, we surveyed local residents, parents, school community, and across the board there was 90% support for more regular street closures at those schools. And third, what these pictures show really clearly is that in a way that perhaps other traffic calming schemes outside schools can't do, the school street really effectively transforms a space which is congested, unhealthy, and frankly dangerous for the hundreds of small people using it each day, and enables children to get about safely under their own steam. And I think Sylvia is probably going to talk more about that from a parent's perspective later. Next slide, please. So that's our experience of school streets, but what formal evidence is there out there that they work? There's evidence emerging. Edinburgh, City of Edinburgh Council produced an excellent report in 2016, but no body of academic literature. We couldn't find anything that pulled together all of the various reports from different local authorities. At Sustrans, there was nothing we could point to when a reticent transport planner or a resident living perhaps a little bit further away from the school said, but what about surrounding streets? Are you not just shifting the problem elsewhere? And there's two reasons we need to fill that gap. One, Sustrans, as any local authorities listening to this in the audience, we want to put in schemes that work. We want to be as confident as possible that we're not causing road safety issues elsewhere and make informed decisions, not act on a hunch. And two, we owe it, I think, to our political leaders. I can't stress highly enough the critical importance of these people to your school street scheme. Without their backing, they simply won't happen. And they put their neck on the line, and the more research and evidence that we can offer them, the easier it is for them to keep speaking out in support in the face of possible backlash. Next slide, please. So a year ago, we applied to the Road Safety Trust for funding to address this research question you can see on the slide. And we were delighted that they recognised the value of this research. So it's two parts, and the first part was to carry out an extensive literature review to uncover all the existing evidence out there. And I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Adrian Davis, who completed that piece of work, to talk more about his findings.
Thank you, Alice. And if I can have the first of my slides, please. So this piece of work really, as Alice has already stated, was trying to pull together a literature which really didn't exist. So in terms of doing a literature review, which is really the simplest form of review you can do, to just see what is out there, that we really would take all study designs of all types of interventions, as long as it had that bottom point on the first section about literature review, which is there was an implementation and there was some measurements so we could see whether something had been effective or not, together with the other sets of criteria that we used for the search. So the find was 16 studies in the English language. Now, none of those were peer reviewed, picking up on Alice's point. So one of them was a master's dissertation, and I was actually able to interview that master's dissertation author, who actually works for Edinburgh City Council, and that is included in the study. But there were no peer-reviewed studies in the English language. I've since found that there is literature, wider literature out there, particularly in Flanders, in the Low Countries, and probably elsewhere, but not in English. So there's a list there of some of the local authorities that were included in this. There were quite a few in Scotland and a lot more in England, and particularly around in Greater London. What we decided after we found that there was such a limited find in the literature was we went back to the Road Safety Trust and said, could we augment this with some semi-structured interviews? And we asked a number of local authorities to be involved in that, and we then undertook 5 semi-structured interviews to augment the data and the evidence that we'd gathered through the literature review. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to canter through the 3 main headings that you would find when you go and look at the report itself. So there's some really clear, important stuff here, and I admit this surprised me as someone who's not really focused much on school street closures before. So one of the clear things that school street closures do not really happen as a result of a road safety casualty problem as reported through Stats 19. It's not a motivator for that. There is not the level of incidents reported that makes this anywhere a case for undertaking action on a objective road safety assessment. But there are nonetheless strong evidence that perceptions of danger are really significant, not least, for example, amongst residents who live on the streets where parents come and park their cars, etc. There is also strong evidence actually that one of the key reasons for undertaking school street closures is to increase active travel on a school journey. Next slide, please. So these are just examples of what the councils have actually said about this. So you've got Solihull there, just making that point that historically there's no hotspots, almost zero KSIs killed or seriously injured on the school journey in total. Similarly, Southampton City Council talking about making a healthy school journey, because that came up time and again as well. And for them, the aim was to disrupt the existing travel behaviours, to try to get a better balance of more children and their families being able to choose to be able to walk or cycle. And then London Borough of Southwark, playing it in, connecting it to the wider Vision Zero, aiming for zero fatalities and serious injuries, and wider issues around air quality as well. So it does connect with a bigger set of issues which we can talk about in the discussion point. And of course, right at the bottom there even talks about child obesity, which is playing into government announcements, which will shortly happen, I think, on that coming up in number 10. Next slide, please. So there is reasonable strength of evidence that the number of motor vehicles across all the schools we looked at reduced. That's one way of measuring. Obviously, you measure it as well as by the change in travel mode and the number of children actively travelling to school, etc. But there's clear evidence that the number of motor vehicles was reduced by the introduction of a school street closure, and that active travel levels did increase, and that the majority, and this is of course really important, the majority of parents and residents living on the closed street and on neighbouring streets support the introduction of school street closures, and more importantly perhaps, or equally importantly, that this goes up once the scheme has been implemented. Next slide, please. So the impact on school travel schemes, the example of Edinburgh, as has already mentioned from the 2016 pilot, but there are some numbers there to show you the overall net outcome of 2,259 fewer vehicle movements around the school. So that, in terms of one of the wider ambitions for hopefully improving safety, for maybe improving air quality, is important, but also the outcome of that must mean we have increases in children travelling actively, and that is reported in other studies. So you can see that, and for specifically one example from the London Borough of Camden at St Joseph's Primary School, again, the indication that driven trips to school had fallen by 43%. And when we actually look at the numbers, they are real numbers. We have to watch out for hiding behind percentages, but these are significant reductions in numbers of vehicles being driven to school. Next slide, please. So the impact on neighbouring streets. Now, this was one of the core things for the Road Safety Trust, particularly this issue of does it cause a road safety problem with motorised transport displacing to neighbouring streets? Well, there was strong and consistent evidence that no, it doesn't, and that's the top line. There is in the detail of that, there are some issues that do occur. We always have one or two people parking badly. That is probably just human behaviour, and there are mitigation measures that are put in place by local authorities to try to deal with some of these issues, and they've been dealt with in all the studies we came across. The mitigation measures resolved very largely any problems that emerged shortly after the scheme was opened. And one of the mitigation measures, or one of the measures that you can put in anyway, just as we have done through school travel plans, etc. in the past, is park and stride. You're trying to have a diffusion. You diffuse the motorised traffic movements by having places that people can park, not just from one side of the school, for example, but having more than one. Next slide, please. So here's an example from Croydon. The numbers again speak for themselves. Reductions of 25% in motorised traffic. Parking fears in Southampton, displacement not really happening. Some small remedial measures put in Southampton to deal with a localised problem. Solihull, I think the point of Solihull was from a network management perspective, it's that last sentence, and from a network management perspective, the impacts have been negligible. So my last slide, please. So these are just issues to consider. We can discuss them in the discussion section. Use of experimental traffic regulation orders, which we're seeing now anyway through the COVID-19 responses, quite common. London only has the use of ANPR, automatic number plate recognition technology. School street closures are often associated with 20 mile/h speed limits, something to think about. I've talked about mitigation measures and park and stride. Nice thing from City of Edinburgh Council saying the demand is just going up. And to add to what Alice mentioned a few minutes ago, Councillor Anna Richardson's just talking about 21 new schemes now being launched in Glasgow. There is a wider potential, which wasn't part of the report, which is why I put the asterisk, that this could be part of what we might talk about as a low traffic neighbourhood. And as ever, as a researcher, I would say, and definitely for this, we do need more quality research. So that's my quick canter through. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. So what happens next? The next stage is to our research and monitoring units taken all of the of Adrian's report and developed a methodology, and they're going to be carrying out intensive monitoring at 2 school streets to look at what happens to traffic flows and to traffic behaviour when you close that street outside the school. They're going to be using some traditional technology to measure traffic speed and volumes, but also some quite innovative video technology to just dig a bit deeper into how vehicles and pedestrians interact at any particular hotspots that might be created. We don't know what we're going to find. We're working in partnership with Birmingham City Council to do this, who are going to be implementing a second phase of their car-free school street scheme after their initial successful pilot at 6 schools last September. And we want it to be as useful as possible for other practitioners. So whilst every school is unique, we've carefully selected sites that should be representative of types of scenarios that other urban local authorities will be looking at. So not just cul-de-sacs, we're looking at large primary schools with multiple entrances in different areas of the city with different urban typologies. And the research will be taking place over the next year, and we'll look forward to sharing the results once we have them. Next slide, please. In the meantime, what we're going to do at Sustrans, well, we're going to make sure that Adrian's work is seen by as many key decision makers as possible, and our teams across the UK will continue to support their local authority partners to implement school streets that are appropriate to their specific local context, whether that be working on behaviour change in schools or the community engagement or testing and trialling school streets. And we're going to continue to advocate for local authorities outside London to have the powers to enforce school streets. Next slide, please. And finally, increasingly at Sustrans, we're starting to look at how school streets interact with low traffic neighbourhoods. Adrian just touched on this. And I suppose what I mean by that is how a school street can be the starting point for wider traffic restriction within a residential area. And we believe this research will be particularly useful for transport planners who are looking at the likely impacts of multiple street closures across a residential area. Next slide, please. So finally, please download the report, Adrian's report, from any of our websites listed there. Also, you can see on Birmingham City Council's website more details of their car-free school street scheme. And yeah, we'll be really happy to answer any further questions in the panel at the end of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you both to Adrian and Alice there. So this is just a reminder. I can see that we are getting quite a few questions coming through, but you can list your questions at any time during any of the presentations. It is just in the questions panel. And as well, this video is going to be recorded and put on YouTube after the presentations have all finished, as well as all of the previous webinars have been recorded and kept on YouTube. So the previous Sustrans presentation that was talked about, you can find that on YouTube, the slides through the presentation, as well as this one once it has been finished. So for our second speaker, we have Sylvia Gauthereau, who will be talking about her work with campaigning for school streets, particularly her work engaging with schools and parents. So Sylvia, if you don't mind, if you can turn on your camera and your microphone, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Doolin. I'm afraid I think the camera doesn't work, so we'll have to do without. So I'm Sylvia Gauthereau, and I'm the founder of School Streets Initiative. Next slide, please. So my journey into school streets advocacy started when I had my own children, and I was faced with scenes like this. This is my primary schools. I'm also, because I cycle to school, I'm also involved with other active travel groups like the Westminster Healthy Street Group and Brain Cycling Campaign. Next slide, please. So just to give you a bit of an idea, this was our journey at my children's school. So it's a fairly long process. It started in 2014, where it was very obvious from the day one, this was a new site, that traffic outside the school gates was a very big issue. So we've approached the council and asked them for help. Over 2 years, it was back and forth with proposals and ideas that didn't really address the full issue. So then in 2016, when Camden got the first school street in London, that's when we realized that that was the solution for us. So then we started to work towards this solution. But as you can see, we are now in 2020, and we still don't have a school street there. There's been other issues with administrative problems, but until COVID, this was a very long process for some of us. So thanks to the change in the regulation with the emergency traffic order and the realization with the government taking those steps, hopefully it will be much shorter for parents and schools and residents around schools from now on. Next slide, please. So we know that school streets do work with varying degrees of success, as Professor Davis acknowledged in his report, but broadly we can say that they do help with reducing road danger, or the perception of road dangers, because when you ask parents when they do get a school street, that's one of the first things they say, that it feels safer. So that's extremely important. They do reduce pollution because there's fewer vehicles on the road. They increase active travel to school because they encourage family to look at alternative modes of transport. They increase independent mobility, which I think is a very important point, and that is unfortunately rarely really considered in all those discussions, because this is something that children nowadays have lost. A lot of us would probably have used to be walking or even cycling much a further distance from home that our children today do, and it's real concern, because there are wider implications to this, and we don't fully understand yet. And obviously, within the context of COVID, having more space for parents to space out on the pavement outside the gate and arriving will facilitate safe distancing. All the research into schools run and the way parents get to schools, there's a strong evidence that parents do want safer and obviously cleaner streets. They want, better for the children. We are told to avoid public transport, so we do need solutions. There's also specific issue in location, like in London, there's still uncertainty over free travel in public transport, and there's a shortage of buses for schools in the thousands. So that's a real worry, that parents do need the support to have active school run. And there's obviously medical evidence, more and more medical evidence that pollution and lack of active travel will worsen the effects of COVID if we do get it. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, there's, until COVID, there were two ways to enforce school streets. So either with bollards or with Napier camera, which at the moment it's only for London councils because they don't have the piece of regulation, which is the moving vehicle order. They don't have that. So the government has expressed the willingness to change that, to give powers to outside of London councils, so they will be able to enforce it. So that will make things much easier for them. And since COVID, obviously, we have emergency school streets, which are enforced with those extendable gates, like this one in Westminster. So there's funding available for school street at the moment, and a lot of councils have actually taken up their offer, so that should make a difference. And there's greater awareness nowadays, because school street is one of the measures that the government mandated the local authority to do. Next slide, please. So the wider picture is there's wide consensus amongst parents. They want what's best for the child. They want clean environment. They want safe environment. Children are naturally active, so it fits perfectly with what they do and their needs. Teachers, the jobs of teachers is not to be traffic warden outside school. So any tool that will help them to just concentrate on what they want to do, which is teaching, is great, because otherwise they do spend quite a lot of time outside the school gate talking to parents and asking them not to park just outside. Residents, obviously, who live near schools do not want their environment to be, a traffic jam twice a day. And most people nowadays are a bit more aware about the air quality issues and adverse effects on health. Next slide, please. So we need to again have more research into long implication on health of the lack of active travel, the loss of independent mobility, and how it does connect with individual behaviour. Because there's a lot of support for better air quality, but then some people do not necessarily related with what they do, like driving to school, things to be outside of this effort. So it's important to connect everything. Safeguarding, so the schools should really look at all those issues. The safety of the children and their health should be part of their safeguarding policies, and it should be completely integrated with the values that sometimes they have, like respect or integrity. And we need to change the way we communicate as well about this, because it is called a closed road, but at the same time it does open it up for everyone else and for more people in a way. Next slide, please. So I think the way to change that is, there's quite a lot of key parties within that could be influential in making it almost automatic. So the council should really integrate the school travel and all those aspects, air quality, road danger, independent mobility, whenever they think of anything. So from housing to planning application, it should completely be integrated into this. So the school street is not actually a legal principle. It is basically it's a pedestrian cycle zone. So maybe there's scope for the government to properly create something there. The schools, the leaderships needs to integrate that, as mentioned previously. Parents should know from day one what's expected from them, so not to come to try to walk or cycle to school. Suppliers should understand that, again, this is a school street, this is outside my school again, so that was our school time in the morning when they were delivering something to the school. So the school should use its power to say this is not acceptable. And obviously academics, there's always need for more research. So we hope that with all the emergency school street coming up, this is going to happen. Next slide, please. So as if you are parents or residents and you want to consider the school be considered for a school street, so just keep campaigning, keep asking, keep engaging with residents, parents, staff. There's quite a lot of information and template later that can be used in those websites. On schoolstreet.org.uk, there's quite a lot of downloaded resource for free you can use. professional have the School Street Hackney toolkit, which is very good. Continue the conversation as often as you need. And also, if you do have a School Street within the context of COVID, do document what people think. It will be really useful for later on when there is a wider document looking at the evidence. Next slide, please. And that's about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvia. So our third presentation today is going to be from Donald from Redbridge, and he is going to be speaking from the perspective of a local authority. Donald, you're already ahead of me. Mic, camera on, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Doolin, for the introduction, and thank you to Landor for letting me tell you what's going on in the world of Redbridge and school streets. So yes, Donald Chalker, although my title is Principal Engineer, I'm very much a transport strategy, transportation person. So why are we doing school streets? As you saw from the initial slide, previously known as school clean air zones. So clean air zones, government framework, okay, slightly different context. But we see on the right-hand side the manifesto, Labour manifesto for Redbridge for the last election was to implement school streets, clean air zone streets around schools, parks and leisure facilities. And it's a growing idea. We've got the Hackney toolkit, and now we're starting to get some academic research, which is helping to raise the profile, along with it being one of the preferred measures regarding the COVID situation. Next slide, please. So we've done a fair few things around Redbridge, as most local authorities have done. We had some funding around air quality from the GLA. Got lots of smarter travel activity taking place. Redbridge has got 100 schools. There are lots of children who travel into the borough for their education there. We also touch on public health, Redbridge Air Action, and play streets has been mentioned before. So there's been a lot around children and streets, travel, and all of that area. Next slide, please. It also hits many other agendas in a local authority. So you see the list there, everything from the back office parking design, air quality, public health. Children is a particular issue in Redbridge. Then the practical operational stuff like play streets, community safety enforcement, road safety and that side of things. I think in Redbridge that there's a number of reasons why we introduce school streets, various strands. So one around air quality. As I said, we started off calling them clean air zones. Road safety, we have Vision Zero for London and the work that's taking place for that programme there. Although fortunately, we have a relatively good or a very good road safety record around schools journeys, as was alluded to before. To encourage children to walk, scoot and cycle. So to pick a phrase from probably 20 or so years ago, reclaiming the streets for children. Clearly at the moment it's one of the measures to assist with the COVID situation, and regretfully, yes, some of this is about parental behaviour. So if you added up the amount of school staff time meant to use to try and encourage parents to park correctly, I'm sure you would get quite a few lessons per year out of that. And every head teacher's got a story about interjections or arguments they've had with parents in front of the children there. So yeah, realistically, that's part of the reasoning too. And part of our conversations with schools is around how we expect this to take pressure off of schools, so staff can be busy preparing lessons and doing what they need to do rather than standing at the front of school at the beginning and the end of day, because we've dispersed the traffic and there's no traffic at the school entrance anymore. Next slide, please. So yes, being in London, I guess we're lucky. We can use AMPR. So the restriction we put in is no vehicles. The streets become for pedestrians and cyclists only. And you can see the signage, the enforcement signage, particularly for the no motor vehicles that we have there. We do have exemptions. Various authorities have different ideas on who or who should not be exempted. But in the main, most vehicles will not be able to enter a school street at the appropriate time. As with all these schemes, enforcement is the key issue. So the tack we've taken in Redbridge is that, yes, we're going to go with ANPR. We have the powers to do so. And yes, it's something that takes, I guess, a fair bit of funding. But it's a system that a local authority can put in. It's a system that works, as we'll see in a slide or two's time. And it means that other people can do their job. So it's great having movable bollards or retractable gates or whatever, but that means that we need to find a person, a volunteer or a resource and take them away from what they were doing previously. Whereas with ANPR camera schemes, it fits with local authority funding around capital funding. So we can roll these schemes out relatively easily. Of course, we can help keep our costs down. We don't necessarily have to have all school streets with cameras at the same time. So that helps to reduce the costs there. And then the other side of the enforcement, whitelisting for residents. So again, something that needs a bit of resource, but a local authority process that we can go into, and that keeps it nice and easy and nice and simple. Next slide, please. So we started in Redbridge with 2 pilots. It's interesting, the transport geography does play a significant part in the design of the school schemes. So the pilot on the left-hand side, the L-shaped pilot, you can see with the red roads there. We cover 2 roads, the junction between the 2 roads, and the 2 short stretches. We've stopped vehicles going in there because otherwise it would become a cul-de-sac. And we'd have parents driving in there, parking, dropping kids off, U-turning while children are walking to school. So we want to avoid that, and the principle is that all parental movements should be able to be made in a forward gear. The second is interesting. It's a short stretch of a longer road. The road is a rat run to avoid a major roundabout just to the south of that. So yes, residents not too badly affected there, and certainly my experience chimes with the outputs of the academic work. Before the scheme started, residents in neighbouring roads were contacting me and saying we're going to get more traffic. There's one particular neighbourhood watch WhatsApp group, had many contacts through that. But since the schemes were implemented, albeit they were cut short with COVID, but since the schemes were implemented, we've not had any negative feedback from the residents there. Next slide, please. So one of the criticisms, we're only in it for the money. Well, that may be what Sainsbury's were in it. You may remember the story, the chief executive of Sainsbury's was caught singing that prior to the failed attempt to merge with Asda. But let's consider the various issues here and the effects that they have. So local government funding always has been an issue. Local authorities are having less of central government grants, and a number of local authorities have set the course to make sure that they are not reliant in any way, shape or form on central government funding. Within society, there's a change around monetisation of poor individual behaviour. So a few years ago, antisocial behaviour, police were going to march people to cash points to amend for their actions. We see it with PCNs and traffic activity, and we see it elsewhere in society. So if you're late picking your child up for nursery, then there'll be a charge for that. And this is something that's changing over the years in society too. To come to the specifics for local authorities, so the Hackney experience, quoted from their toolkit, beginning of the school term, September, an average of 11 PCNs a day. In May, towards the end of that academic year, 2 PCNs a day. So you can see that neither Tim nor I are going to be retiring to the Bahamas anytime soon. But we're also clear, and this is something that we say when we speak with schools, with residents, with ward councillors, a scheme that's making money is clearly a failed scheme. The point of the scheme is to deter people. So if we're still getting lots of people infringing, then we need to look at the scheme and understand why. Is the traffic geography such that people are having to go that way? Whatever, but clearly if we're still receiving as many PCNs as the end of the school year as we did at the beginning of the school year, something's amiss and something needs to be looked at. Next slide, please. So in Redbridge, our first 2 school street pilots started in December last year, cut short middle end of March with COVID. But what could we have done better? What lessons can I pass on to yourselves? I think greater pre-restriction on street publicity. So I'd recommend having something certainly on street 2 weeks in advance, maybe 4 weeks in advance. We've got triangular Corex panels that just sit around a lamp column, very brightly coloured, give people information about the school streets, and it's assigned to both pedestrians and drivers as to what is going on. Monitoring, yes, I agree with the academic research. I'm not an academic, but yes, we need more monitoring. Air quality monitoring is difficult, or not difficult, but not very common. So we have diffusion tubes. Well, that's great, but that doesn't really give the picture. We're investing in a couple of air quality monitors, which are going to give us the data, which gives us the peak in poor pollution at school start and school finish times. Fingers crossed, I hoped. Also, yes, monitoring nearby roads. So where's the traffic being dispersed to, or does it just evaporate and go? Signage, yes, we've been picked up a couple of times with this, but yes, we clearly need to make sure that school streets are adequately signed, or more than adequately signed, because as we say, the intention is that we just don't want people driving down these streets, that the money is not the driver for all of this. To help with implementation, we have a 4-week grace period when schemes commence. We started with a 2-week period where we only issued letters to people who'd infringed the restriction. We're extending that to 4 weeks to give time for letters for the AMPR to be reviewed, for letters to be generated, to be sent out, for people to receive the letters and to change their behaviour, modify behaviour then before we start issuing PCNs. Also to highlight that this is a restriction and it's not a ban on motor vehicles. Yes, we get castigated for being anti-driver. No, it's not anti-driver, it's pro-child. This is something that when the legal review, Ellie Kissy Deborah, is going through at the moment, and if that goes through and the anticipated outcome that she lived 25 metres from the South Circular, the anticipated outcome is that she would be the first person who will formally have death due to poor air quality on her death certificate there. So yeah, we need to be clear that this is not a ban against drivers, but it's something that's pro-children. And also, as I said, the journey in Redbridge, we're now talking school streets, not clean air zones. So we got a number of residents saying, I've got a car that meets the low emission zone in London restrictions, why can't I drive down a school street? Or I've got an electric car, why can't I drive down a school street? Well, yes, that's fine. It covers off the air quality issues, but it doesn't cross off the road safety or the encouraging children to walk, scoot and cycle issues there. Next slide, please. Issues for September 2020. You'd think, who knows now? Well, I was tasked with working with 10 schools at the beginning of the summer holidays and 4 schools I've yet to receive a response from. I hope very much that the schools know what the situation is, but it's still quite fluid. Staggered timings, they've got a TMO implication, so we went for an experimental TMO. Fortunately, the timings we've got pretty much cover the new staggered starts at the school. But that's something to bear in mind, and perhaps suggest that you're more generous with your timings for your TMO or TRO than you perhaps need to be to cater for these things. But of course, being an experimental TMO, that gives us the opportunity to change things. So maybe we have different timings in January, different timings in Easter. Who knows? But we shall see. Funding for smarter travel support. So yes, school streets are the stick, but smarter travel is the carrot. We have less funding this year than in past years, but with each school, we hope to do some form of smarter travel support, whether it's infrastructure for cycle storage or soft support, but we try to do something there. The other challenge we have is upscaling. So 2 pilots, easily manageable. If you've got 10 schools coming online, well, yes, you need a system that's capable of managing and catering for that. And a question that's been put back to October, but in London, what's happening for children's travel and the Zip Oyster cards? And what's the expected change in parental behaviour there? Are more children going to be driven to school because all of a sudden they have the bus fare potentially to pay from October? Next slide, please. Okay, well, that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be around to answer questions at the Q&A session at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Donald. Tim from Videalert is up next. So Tim, if you can unmute yourself and turn on your microphone, please.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Tim Daniels. As Doolin says, I'm a director. I'm the client development director at Videalert. Videalert was actually acquired by Marston Holdings back in April of last year. Marston are one of the UK's largest transportation and enforcement services groups. And we're actually delighted to be now part of a much bigger structure. Focus of my presentation today is really the drive towards active travel and safer school streets. Obviously, moving on from the other panelists in terms of beginning to look at what options in terms of enforcement options there are and approaches that we've utilized over the past 12 months. Next slide, please. In terms of what I want to do is focus a little bit briefly in terms of what the impact of COVID has been in terms of lockdown, what we're seeing in terms of post-lockdown bounce back, what we see as the new normal, obviously the focus on active travel and safer school schemes, and kind of summarize what we're doing at the end. Next slide, please. As many of you know, in terms of the impact of COVID, most local authorities basically lifted all parking restrictions. All cameras were switched off, schools were closed, essentially all enforcement was stopped, and CEOs were redeployed for emergency services. So a pretty awful situation, really. In terms of, next slide, please. In terms of post-lockdown, what we're seeing is parking restrictions were broadly lifted back in June. Traffic volumes have pretty much returned back to pre-COVID levels, and that's been stimulated by obviously people feeling more comfortable in terms of using private vehicles as opposed to public transport. But this is presenting some major challenges in terms of, you know, the normal on-street enforcement operations, with CEOs now needing to maintain social distance, and it's fueling, if you like, a drive towards, you know, automated ANPR and camera technology. So a larger number of councils are looking to utilize camera-based enforcement, as well as mobile vehicles and bikes. for the purposes of supporting these schemes. Next slide, please. The government, obviously the government funding in terms of DEFRA, the 2 billion package, has fueled a real drive towards active travel, getting people to basically walk and cycle to school. But it's also basically meant that councils are looking at adapting road layouts, adapting residential areas with closures of roads, providing improved green spaces and playgrounds, and creating what are called low traffic neighbourhood zones as well, particularly prevalent in London. Next slide, please. So where the real focus of active travel is that schools are a major concern, both from a safety and air quality perspective, as we've heard before. They're introducing a number of ways to enforce and support those goals. Cameras are traditionally used to enforce school keep clear zones. We've got examples where cameras have been used using public space protection order legislation for regulating vehicle use and dropping off kids and picking up kids on school streets around the schools themselves. And even we've heard of local authorities looking to establish red routes around schools as a way to provide effective enforcement. Obviously, the government recently, under TMA, allowed enforcement of mandatory cycle lanes. So they extended TMA, and we think that's probably going to be a precursor to a more extensive allowance to allow councils outside London and Wales to utilise moving traffic legislation as well in the not too distant future. Next slide, please. In terms of some of the examples we've supported, obviously we have a number of councils that we're delivering unattended enforcement of school keep clear zones, and that is clearly covered under the current TMA 2004. Those councils are examples of councils utilising our system, right, for school keep clear zone enforcement. Similarly, I mentioned the PSBO legislation. We have the London Borough of Havering, who introduced a scheme using that legislation. And in fact, what they're about to do now is repurpose some of that, well, all of those cameras to basically a school street scheme. So that is moving, and that will obviously be conducted under a different legislation. And in terms of school streets themselves, that is categorized as a moving traffic contravention. So currently, legislation is only permissible in London, but we have a number of examples, obviously Don and Redbridge being one, but other councils such as Kingston, Newham, Richmond, Wandsworth and Westminster are all accelerating their school street programs. Next slide. So what I'll show you is some examples. So this is our camera in operation for capturing a parked vehicle on a school keep clear zone. This is an automated process. The vehicle has clearly stopped on the school keep clear zone. We've captured the video and we've captured the signage, and that is the full extent of the operation. Next slide. This is slightly different. So this is the Havering example, where a vehicle has parked in a street close to a school clearly dropping off a child, and that is exactly the behaviour that the council was seeking to capture and basically prevent going forward. So that again is an automated camera that's detected that parked vehicle about 50 meters away and has automatically zoomed in and captured the evidence. Next slide. As I said, we're part of a much bigger group now, Marston Holdings, and Marston have a number of companies that can provide a full end-to-end solution from designing school street schemes, low traffic neighborhood schemes, right through to building and enforcing. So complete end-to-end package. Next slide. So in summary, lockdown has demonstrated obviously the ability to improve air quality through reduced traffic levels. Those traffic levels are now back to normal levels, and in fact, if anything, we're going to see increased traffic based on the fact that the public are not keen on using public transport currently. Obviously, the government funding is fueling this active travel, which is creating new road layouts, encouraging more cycling and walking to schools. And obviously, as a complete package, we as a company are there to support the enforcement end to end. Thank you. I think that's it.
Great, thank you very much for that, Tim. So that brings us to the Q&A portion of the webinar. And I'm going to ask for all panelists to turn back on their videos, and Tim, if you don't mind rejoining us, as well as their microphones, so we can start the Q&A session. So we have about 15 minutes left of the webinar, but are happy to extend the amount of time for the Q&A, as there are quite a lot of questions to get through. So we will be going over by just a little bit for those who are interested in staying on beyond 11:45. So as a reminder, you can still submit questions in the question panel. That's part of the control pane, and you're welcome to address questions either to a specific speaker or to the panel as a whole. And we'll get through as many as we possibly can in the next little bit. So let's get started. I think overwhelmingly, the question focus for a part of the webinar was to do with questions about enforcement. So I think that there's a lot of interest in how school streets are being enforced, and specifically how school streets are being enforced post-lockdown and in this kind of COVID era where there isn't as much funding as has been in the past. So these questions I'm going to address to the panel as a whole, and I'll try to get round to everyone for them. So the first question has regarding barriers, the use of barriers for enforcement. So this is something along the lines of parents or teachers marshalling turtle barriers. So the first question is there a record of a case study of schools who are using this, and how effective are they? Whoever would like to start with that question, Sylvia, shall we start with you?
Hi, I'm not sure they have time to monitor and to assess properly, but I know that, for instance, in Westminster, they are using turtle gates, and the concept is that the school will sign a memorandum of understanding. So the idea is the gate is just put there outside by a member of staff, but then it's just left there. It's not required for the staff to man it. So I think for the odd residents coming in, it's kind of accepted that they might want to move it and go through if they need to. But basically this is that. Otherwise, there's also schools where the caretaker is quite happy to just stay by the gate, the buyer, and just move it as and when required.
I can speak to that too a little bit. I'm not sure if there's a written up case study, but yeah, in Southwark in London, Bessemer Grange Primary was the first school in Southwark that trialled a school street a couple of years ago, and for the first 3 months they used turtle gate barriers there, possibly even longer, but the intention was they would be for the first 3 months, and that was, as Sylvia said, that was a caretaker. And speaking to the parent champion there, you know, it was about an hour, a good hour of his day each day was putting out those barriers and taking them back in. The understanding was that residents would contact the school if they were going to need access, so he wasn't standing by the barriers. Other examples in COVID times, it's not something I've directly been involved with, but I know that Calderdale Council in the northwest of England successfully managed to have 10 schools with volunteers manning barriers for at least a fortnight leading in the summer term, but no idea how that will progress. I personally don't think it's a sustainable solution, having volunteers manning barriers for an ongoing amount of time that's unclear. So yes, it has been done, but it's very much dependent on the school. Southampton, I've got colleagues working in Southampton. For a lot of schools, that was the showstopper, that when schools understood that they were going to have to staff it, and as Sylvia said in her presentation, teachers are there to educate our children not to be traffic wardens. And yes, you can find pockets where there are parent volunteers who are keen to help out, or caretakers, but it's case by case, and I haven't got a written case study to offer you, I'm afraid, for COVID times.
I think that does seem to be concern issues with having barriers. Who's going to staff them? Is there, lot of facility issues? And is this a good use of funding? Some councils we know are plowing ahead with this, and if they're putting in school streets in the new term. We have a question for where would they get? What's the best barriers to use? And they located? How much do they cost? Is there any views from the panel?
No one else wants to speak to it. I mean, I don't have costings, particularly of barriers. It's been a whole hodgepodge of what people can get hold of, as I'm sure Donald or someone working in a local authority. There's been such a run on cones. There's been a run on every type of turtle gate, scissor gate. So it's very much been what's been available in the, that suppliers can get to local authorities in time. I mean, we have had examples for previously. Sustrans, for 1 day street closure, has, I think I had one of the pictures, has done something as simple as getting one of the vinyl banners printed up and having that was perched on the school's Connect 4 plastic play materials from their playground. I wouldn't say that's the best solution, but it's possible. So the cost can be from very small through to, but at the moment it's a case of what the supply.
Tim?
Yeah, my understanding is that they're useful as a sort of temporary measure, and have been utilised, very much in that way. Also, in terms of validating, the case for a school street. So as a precursor to a full-blown scheme, that's the way I've seen them utilised.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sylvia?
Yeah, I would say that because this is all very new for many councils, I would recommend the officers are quite happy to talk to each other. So if you can, find a school street near you or a different county, just if you're an officer, do not hesitate to reach out, because you're all in the same. This is all new for many. So there's lots of knowledge out there now, and people are quite happy to share their experience, their supplier, and how they get along with that. I know that in London, they do talk to each other quite a lot, and it's really, really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that point, Hackney's School Street Toolkit was mentioned earlier, and this toolkit was produced looking at school streets before COVID became an issue here. But there are, a fair amount of information there about enforcement possibilities. It doesn't quite look as closely at the COVID examples of the kind of the quick and fast enforcement, but we are operating, so everyone knows, an advice hotline from now until the end of September for other local authorities, and it's funded by Healthy Streets Everyday Partnership. And boroughs are welcome to use that, and I can add the links later when this video has been posted to access that as a resource, because it really is a situation where the more we're sharing with each other, the better, and that, you know, local authorities, but it's also important that residents are talking to each other and campaigners are talking to each other as well. So we'll move on from the enforcement. I think some more questions are coming in, so we might get back to that in our extra time. The next question has to do with starting a scheme from scratch, and maybe Donald, I might direct these towards you. So firstly, the first question is one of our these questions is about getting started. And are there any top tips if you're starting a scheme, local authority from scratch? What would your top tip be?
So our two pilots were schools where we knew they had issues. We have strong smarter travel engagements. We'd worked with them over the preceding years, and the schools were very much up for a school street. Alongside that, the local residents in the immediate vicinity of the school gates, again, they were contacted the ward councillors, made their views known, and it was clear from both residents and the school that there were places to go. So I guess the first two pilots were the willing. We're now rolling out school streets. We have a programme for schools across the whole of the borough, for hopefully about 40 to be implemented over the coming academic year. For that, we worked out a prioritiser matrix, for want of a better description. We put together a spreadsheet, put in various factors, smarter travel engagements, level of car travel to school, reflection of the local transport geography, etc., through all of 100 schools into a spreadsheet, and it came out with a populated list, and we're pretty much starting at the top and moving down. But I think, yeah, the key is for the first schools, make sure that they're sites where there are clear problems, but where you've got clear support and commitment from both residents and schools, and take it from there.
Great, thank you. Our next questions have to do with research. So Adrian, I might direct these towards you. So the first question is from Jonathan, and he was asking about your research. Did it take into account seasonal changes?
So some of these interventions that were included in the literature review covered large periods of time in terms of across the full academic year. The first school street closure started, it seemed, in the UK in 2012, which is interesting, maybe as a marker in time. Someone may be able to say it started earlier here. But they have been going on across the seasons. So we do have a picture. There are changes across the time period. I didn't have a lot of data telling me perhaps about the dips in active travel during the winter season. So I think what I'm going to, just for time sake here, is say more data is really needed. I know there are a lot more local authorities now involved in school street closures, and that we were able to pick up on for the study. And I think if we were able to aggregate that data up, we'd have a much better ability to answer your question. But I think undoubtedly, of course, you will get natural dips in the seasons in terms of the tendency of more parents to want to drive their children to school, perhaps in the winter season.
Thanks for that, and I'll follow up, Adrian, with you on a second question for this. We had someone say that it was great to hear about the research and the monitoring that's being done. What's missing? What hasn't been done yet that would be useful for school streets?
Well, academically, systematic review. Systematic reviews are really one of the ways to try to reduce bias and to reduce the have a cutoff in terms of the quality of the evidence what I said at the start of my talk was we took everything we could because there was a small find. We'd worked out that there was likely to be a small find, and it was. So we took every type of design. So we generally just have pre-post interventions, but we could be looking for intervention studies with controls, for example, to have a clearer picture about the effect of school street closures. Maybe that wouldn't be so important because we think we are fairly confident that when you do implement a school street closure, it is the school street closure that changes the behaviour. But of course, there are other things going on in the local network that we aren't necessarily aware of. So controls would be good. So in terms of the quality of the evidence, we do need to have a larger literature, and that will come as more schools do more school street closures, or more local authorities do more street closures, and we hopefully get more academics doing the studies of these to put them into the literature. It gives, again, the local authorities by return perhaps greater confidence and answer more questions than we can currently answer.
I think just to add to that quickly on the seasonal one, when we're doing the monitoring in Birmingham, that's something that our research and monitoring team's really mindful of. It's an absolute headache trying to line everything up, but making sure that the pre-monitoring and the monitoring straight after the school street's gone in, and then the follow-up monitoring over 6 months later, are all at comparable seasonal points of the year. COVID could put a spanner in the works, but that's something that the road safety trustees are very mindful of. And in terms of other things, there's also going to be a control site in that monitoring. So because Birmingham's putting in 5 or 6 school street schemes, we're monitoring it too, but we can have a control, which is really great. In terms of things that are missing, Donald, I think, mentioned the air quality question. For me, that's something that we've had the same experience in Sustrans. It's something that's really tricky to measure, and there's lots of different methodologies used, different levels of sensitivity of sensor used, different local authorities have different networks. But for me, something that could give me confidence, even when we're talking about low traffic neighbourhoods as well as school streets, of if some traffic is displaced, what extent of an area benefits from improved air quality. That's something that I think there's a gap in current research.
Sylvia?
Yes, I think in terms of what's missing, I think it's the nationwide legal framework with the uniform signature for everyone. I think it would also help. So if all the tools and all the school street as a concept legally, it would be good if it was something that is set in law, and with the DFT compliance sign would be a good thing, I think.
Mm.
Great, thank you. The next question has to do with getting people on board with school streets. So it's obvious that there's a range of listeners in today. Some are already operating school streets, are wondering how to deal with these new ones, and some are just getting started on the process, and others seem to be not sure if they're getting started or not and just considering it. And a barrier to that is how the public perception of school streets. And the question that's coming through is, what's the best way to convince critics to get on board with school streets? Specifically, who should they be looking out for as a main critic, and how to convince that person or that group to get on board? And this is both, from experience, from what you've seen in other places. What are kind of the best ideas, and the worst offenders isn't quite the right term, but those who are critical. And I'll open that up to Adrian. I think you just beat him to the mark, so why don't you start us off?
Okay, so I only want to put as a background to this, just a little bit more flesh on the bone of what I said earlier. So in the schools that we looked at, and the local authority data we looked at, it was clear that those schools, as Donald had mentioned earlier, they were the willing, and often they were early adopters, if you like, of doing the intervention. But one of the key things, which when I pointed out, this is not really about road safety in terms of measured by Stats 19, it is about road safety in terms of defining road safety, as I did in the studies. Road safety is more than the sum of casualties. We have to move away from that simplistic view to understand it's about fear, and fear suppressive walking and cycling. So we have to remove the fear factor. And the perception of fear the street is dangerous. When you talk to a lot of residents in these school streets, they'll say it is an accident waiting to happen. Now, we all know that, and we've heard that one many times, and probably it isn't because you have risk compensation going on that people take extra notice because it looks dangerous as well. But it is the perception of fear. I think we can build on the residents' unhappiness often that the current situation is not a good situation for them to be in, even if it doesn't lead to actual injury, to build support. What we found in the studies, just to reiterate what I said earlier, is the three elements of it are: you need clearly the resident support, you need the school support as a starter, and then you need the parents, carer support. And once you've got all three of those, it's fine. But I think building on the underlying concern around schools that it's a complete mess, as I think Sylvia's slide outside her primary school showed, is a good way to be able to say we can make this a lot better, and people will feel that it is safer as well as it actually being objectively safer.
And just to make a note, sorry, before Donald continues, we are at just past 11:45 now. We're going to continue on for probably another 5 minutes or so, as long as the speakers can stay, just to get through some of the questions. So Donald, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there are three groups of people who potentially are adversely affected or perceive that they're adversely affected with school streets. The first is people who want to drive anywhere at any time, regardless of the consequences, and we get told we're anti-driver, etc., etc. Well, that's not particularly an issue here. We're pro-children, not anti-driver. The second is those parents who we acknowledge with education policy around schools and selecting pupils as it is and parental choice, there will be some people who will need to drive to deposit children at different schools in different parts of the borough and go to work. So hence the emphasis on it's a restriction and not a ban. But yes, we do want to modify their behaviour. We don't particularly want to make their days harder, although it may contribute to that. But this is something that benefits all children, including their own children. So they have cleaner air as they get to the school gates. And if they're in the car less, then there are studies showing that pollution's worse inside cars than outside cars on the school run. So that's the second group. The third group are those residents who live just on the borders of the school street, where we get or potentially get the dispersal of parking. So we acknowledge some parents will still have to want to drive, and they will still need to park up somewhere. Now, as I said in my speech, we had 3 or 4 roads where they thought that this was going to be an issue, and I've heard little if nothing post the event. And the academic research again shows that actually dispersion, which is actually a good thing. It's second best to banning things altogether, but dispersion is the second best result. But we're not getting the dispersion that's feared. The traffic evaporates, or it's at a much lower level than before. So yeah, 3 groups of people who potentially are going to be adversely affected, and 3 reasons why I don't think that that's particularly an issue.
Can I just add one more group, which I find that my London colleagues, they don't find this such a problem, but elsewhere in the country, school staff as well. I think perhaps maybe in some London schools there isn't a big staff car park, and London staff maybe use public transport more. They don't expect to be able to drive to school, but elsewhere in the country, often there is an expectation as a member of teaching staff that you drive to school and there's a staff car park. So just being aware of them, and having the head teacher on board early to explain to their staff that it's not a ban, it's a restriction at these times, and if they're going to arrive, then they need to be coming in early. You may find that you think a school's against the scheme, but it's just that communication needs to happen with the school staff early to explain to them.
So if I can just come back on that, one of the things I do, I speak with staff at each school before the scheme, as the scheme's being developed, as the scheme goes in, so they understand. The restriction timings are agreed in conjunction with the school, so I know that school staff have to be in contractually half an hour before school starts, so we make sure that all school staff who are on time are able to get into school okay. we need a sympathetic system around the PCN handling, and yes, if a member of staff is running late, schools, if their child's sick or traffic or whatever, then that needs to be dealt with sympathetically. Also, our schemes are only enforced upon entry, so in the afternoons that's not particularly an issue. It's only an issue in the mornings. And I think it's the school learning support assistants who are the trickiest to incorporate within the scheme, because they arrive and depart at different times during the day. But again, it's a case of taking on all stakeholders' concerns and coming up with a scheme and a methodology to cater for that.
I'm going to finish off with the final two questions here. The first one is directed at Tim. Tim, this is largely about cameras. So the question is, how long does it take for the cameras to cover their costs?
How long's a piece of string? I mean, typically on a school, I can quantify on a school keep clear zone. A school street, obviously you can replicate the numbers, but typically if you're doing 1 or 2 PCNs per day per school, you can get a return on investment in less than 12 months.
Short and snappy, thank you. The final question is about roles. So we're in a bit of a new situation with School Street, and obviously everyone has a role to play with the program. But what is the role for not-for-profits and campaigners in the new School Street? What is the most important role that they have? And Alice and Sylvia, I'll direct this towards you.
Do you want to go first, Sylvia?
Yeah, I think our role is to make the information available and just to continue the conversation, because communication is key in this. As sometimes people be reluctant, but it's simply because they don't have the full information or the full picture. And so I think that would be our role. Talk to them.
Alice?
Yeah, I mean, that's the way I'd say our role hasn't really changed from pre-COVID. I think our approach, certainly on School Streets, has always been to do quite a bit of what Sylvia talking about. So, you know, certainly that's been a big part of my role, to make sure within our teams that we're sharing internal learning, we're working with local authorities all around the UK, but also working separately to that, bringing together local authorities where we see a pioneering local authority, you know, linking them up. Like, I don't work specifically with Leeds, but seeing what they did, link them up with Liverpool so they can talk and share the ideas. And I think that's really important. Also being there to help with the influencing, like, you know, I highlighted it in my presentation that political will is so important, and that's where not-for-profits can play a role, helping influence with the local councillors, local stakeholders, and also playing a role behind the scenes, you know, speaking to our head of public affairs. You know, she's been involved in those conversations behind the scenes very actively about the need for the enforcement powers outside London, and so keeping that pressure on as well, and getting government to commit to a date on that.
I'm just going to get, I've seen Adrian and Donald both put their hands up. So Adrian, would you like to go first, and then Donald, and then I'm going to wrap this up.
Okay, so just very quickly, it's just to add the international dimension. I only touched on it very briefly. One of the items in the 16 items of literature was from Ghent in Flanders. So it's just to remind us that this is an international activity. It's not just happening in the UK. That's quite positive. Polis, which is the international network on these sorts of issues of traffic management and other stuff to improve active travel take up. They have got the report that's being disseminated across Europe, and I am in conversations with colleagues in Ghent about how we might do something on an international stage. But I think, you know, it's important to see ourselves as part of a wider archipelago of interventions across Europe.
And Donald, if you don't mind keeping it just to a minute, I would appreciate it.
Yes, yeah. I think it's important that we get this wider economy, the academic, the non-governmental organisations and groups like that, because as has been said, they can coordinate, they can pass on information, but they also act as a sounding board for politicians, and certainly discussions and consultations with politicians. So no, this isn't some mad highways engineer coming along with an idea. Well, actually, there's a national organisation that's pushing these things. It's global. It's the EU. It's wider, and it helps us in our job. So we can refer to various reports or websites or whatever, and it just gives a wider, more rounded picture, which is useful for selling to all stakeholders, be they pro or against school streets.
Great, thank you. Tim, just as a courtesy, you didn't have an opportunity. Is there anything you'd like to add to that before we come to a close?
No, I'll just pick up on the one aspect in terms of the air quality monitoring. I mean, obviously we're now integrating air quality monitoring with enforcement camera technology. So you have the ability to validate, right, the impact of enforcement, right, on improved air quality for, and correlate that. So that technology is now coming right to the market. We're not the only people, but that ability to integrate your enforcement camera with an air quality sensor is there and available.
Good to know. All right, so we're officially over time, and I'm going to bring the session to a close with a few remarks. So firstly, it's clear from this session and otherwise that there's a great interest in school streets. And there are, as we've just talked about, a lot of different groups working hard to make things happen. So charities and campaigners, drumming up support like we've just spoken about, businesses providing infrastructure and tools as well as services, monitoring and otherwise, local authorities who are actually planning and implementing these projects, and academics, which is a great new kind of foray. They're here to provide research-based justification and to question some of the things we're doing as well, of course. So school streets have been, where I'm from in Hackney, they've been on the agenda for numerous years, and I have to say I'm absolutely thrilled to see them gaining attention nationally and internationally. And I think that there's a lot to be done, both in my borough and outside, but the more knowledge that we're sharing on platforms like this, the more progress we can make, both as a whole and on our specific schemes. So I'll close by thanking today's speakers for their insightful presentations, and as well, of course, to Videalert for the sponsorship of today's session. And just as a reminder, this is one of numerous webinars as part of the school transport series, and all of the sessions are going to be recorded and uploaded to the Landor Links YouTube channel. So thank you, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their day. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.